Okay, welcome. Base case 014, Effortless Mastery Part 2. I'm your host, Phil. Just to recap the last episode, number 13, I talked about how we as musicians get caught up in the idea of getting better, which we should because we always want to advance our playing. But we also get caught up and I think trapped in the idea that all progress is made with the instrument in our hands. That we have to practice our way out of problems, that we practice our way into getting better. And that is truth. But it's not everything. It's not 100% of that. It's not the only way. It's not always about taking reps on your instrument and rehearsing, and getting closer to Kenny Werner's book, which, this is part 2 of that, how we feel about ourselves as players, how we feel about the way we play. And if you don't feel positive about yourself as a musician, you're likely not going to play to potential. I mean, think about it. If you don't feel good about your playing, then you're going to go in there and you're not going to play good. You're going to play at the level that you feel. If you play better in the practice room or in your studio at home than you do in rehearsal, lessons, and performances, that's the red flag to me that there's a problem of playing to your potential and playing to that level at which you're at. And that problem is usually that there's some mental baggage in a way. And a lot of times we can't practice our way out of that. Now, sometimes we can. We're not familiar with a piece of music, and that makes us nervous. But a lot of times, it's music that we're familiar with, but then we get to the rehearsal or even we get to our practice studio and things aren't working for us. And a good place to check where that mental baggage begins is how we practice and how we deal with practicing. And the first quote that grabs me is on page 10 in the preface of Kenny's book, and he quotes, and I'm going to quote him, "Many people are crippled by an inability to focus and a sense of being overwhelmed. These problems are often mistaken for laziness." And this quote goes hand in hand with the quote I used on my podcast before about Mark Twain's secret of getting ahead. Mark Twain, the great writer of Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. He said the secret of getting ahead is getting started. And the secret of getting started is breaking your complex, overwhelming tasks into small, manageable tasks and getting started on that first one. And I've talked about that in previous episodes. There's so much stuff to practice. Where do you begin? And on page 106, Kenny writes the quote, "You can learn more from penetrating the form of one tune than you can by merely memorizing many tunes." Some deep immersion is what he calls it. And he says if you can deal with that, you will evolve to another level of playing. On page 108 and 109, Kenny tells the story of attending Bill Evans' 50th birthday party. Bill Evans, the great pianist that started off his career with Miles Davis and went on to a solo career working with trios, was asked, how much do you practice? And he says, Bill's answer was, "I practice the minimum." And people thought that he was putting them on and that he meant that he didn't practice very much, meaning he didn't sit at the piano very often and go, "Wow, Bill Evans doesn't practice much. He's naturally great." But he was signifying. He meant that he practiced only one thing and dealt with that solely, just that one concept. I read in his bio, How in My Heart Sings, that he did that with the tune Blue and Green before he recorded it on Kind of Blue with Miles Davis. It's a 10-chord progression, relatively simple in some ways, but deceptive. It's so short. And he spent hours the night before that session just running those 10 bars, reharmonizing and looking for the different possibilities for lines and chords that he could place in there. Now think about the things that we do well, non-musical, like signing your name, or starting up and pushing a lawnmower, day-to-day things. But think about it. There's technical aspects to those activities that you were not always able to do. But you do them so many times now, signing your name, right? Me, I always think about pushing that lawnmower. I've been doing that since I was a kid, getting it started and mowing the lawn. But these are the same concepts and ideas that we might do with our instrument. Let's say like play an E-flat major scale or walk a B-flat blues. One way to look at it is deep practicing or deliberate practicing. It's taking that one concept, one tune, one scale, and working it over and over, playing it, and moreover thinking about it, thinking about the fingering, Kenny Werner tells a story of being completely disengaged from music. He was burned out at one point, and finding a teacher that gave him a 5-finger exercise to practice on piano for 5 minutes a day for 2 weeks. That was his assignment for 2 weeks daily, to practice this 5-finger, very simple exercise for exactly 5 minutes a day, no more. And the first thing that Kenny noticed was that he was practicing regularly, because the reason he wasn't practicing before is because he thought he needed to practice 5 hours a day, and he had all these things that he needed to practice and wanted to get better at. And a lot of players have that problem. There's so much to practice that we become paralyzed and don't practice at all. Throughout the day we keep putting it off with good intentions to practice, but it's so overwhelming to think about. Am I going to work on my technicals? I've got to work on my scales. I need to work on these slurs. I've got to learn this tune. I've got to get a solo together for this tune. I've got to practice these charts. I've got to practice this book for this gig coming up. And it becomes very overwhelming. Anyway, Kenny practiced this pattern for 5 minutes a day, and it changed his life because he realized that only practicing 5 minutes a day, it felt good because he accomplished something. Now, I'm not saying that you can make a career out of this. It's more, his point is more metaphoric, and it's more analogous. When I read that story, though, I got it. And after a while, I started working only on one concept at a time. Now, how do you do that? How do we do that? Here's a good example. And this is where I started at. I took a F blues, a set of changes that I've used on this podcast before, and determined what I want to do with it. And I started thinking, I want to work out my walking. So for a week, more than 5 minutes a day, I just walked F blues changes. I didn't think about all the other tunes that I wanted to learn. I didn't think about soloing. I didn't think about playing heads. I just thought about walking and listening to myself, and walking and only walking. And then I moved on into developing solos over it and learning heads. And it was liberating, because I was doing that kind of deep learning, that deep dive into one tune. And I started noticing something, that it affected the walking that I did on tunes completely unrelated to F blues, because they still had similar changes. They still moved in fourths in many ways. Maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you're not walking through changes yet. Maybe you can only play whole notes or two feel over F blues, like we talked about in previous episodes. Absorb that, wear it out, penetrate it, in 5-minute increments. Don't allow yourself to think you need to do this for 5 hours a day. I hear student musicians talking about how many hours a day they practice. I don't completely believe that, because a lot of that practicing may not be real penetrative practicing, but actually playing the same things that they feel comfortable with. Now let's go back to that 5 minutes of practicing that Kenny talked about early in the book. And he says, on page 62, he says, you don't realize the benefits of focused, patient practice for even 5 minutes. And then he goes on to say, 5-minute interludes center the mind. And many people, including myself, sometimes feel the onset of anxiety, another word for fear at the mere thought of practice. Now, Kenny Werner says that. Why? How long should they practice, and what should they begin with that day? These 5-minute sessions, if you will, which I use in various situations myself, like between classes, or I'm waiting for a bass student to show up, or I'm cooking dinner and waiting for the water to boil. I'm very fortunate my studio is right next to the kitchen, right? They're significant. One of my professors, Dan Hurley, said as much. He taught at UNT for decades. He said the same thing. He goes, those 5-10-minute increments of practicing one thing, Now, do I try to practice the entire Eccles movement 2 in 5 minutes? No, of course not. I'll practice a phrase within there that's giving me problems, Do I practice, multiple solos over F blues? No, I practice what I'm going to do on the turnaround for 5 minutes. Do I practice the entire melody to solar in 5 minutes? Well, maybe sometimes, I know that tune pretty well, but one phrase will do and does work. And the beauty of this idea is that the 5 minutes, if I have more time, and in many cases I do, turns into 10 minutes and 15 minutes, and practicing becomes more enjoyable, as it should be, because I'm making my goals happen. Now, I practice on average about 90 minutes to 2 hours a day, broken up into increments, right? I can't sit there and practice for 2 hours at a time. But I'm not the only one doing this concept. And I'm not in a hurry to quit working on those F blues changes or that phrase from the Eccles when that's all I'm working on. And I'm getting into it deeper and I'm penetrating it. Now, there's one other concept, and I'll leave you with this. When I practice, particularly trouble spots, I practice them with a lot of patience. Now, you think about that word. When people are being patient, when they're, and I'm talking about it in a non-musical sense, you're talking to somebody or somebody's talking to you, the first thing that you notice is that everything slows down. Their voice slows down, people's heartbeat slows down, their breathing slows down, and that patience and that slowing down has to be a part of your practicing. I'm moving slowly. I take my time so that my mind and body can cooperate in learning the set of changes or this lick or this phrase or this 3-octave scale that I'm working on, And this is a concept straight out of Sin and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance too. So think about that, and I'm going to be talking about on my next episode about practicing slowly. So I'll leave it right there and save that for the next episode, and I'll talk to you soon.